I'm Demoy Nash, Superintendent of the Public Gardens Division at MICAF. In this video, I'll be demonstrating to you how to establish a lawn by using the plug method. By the end of the video, you should be able to select a plug, select appropriate tools, materials, and equipment needed for establishing a turf by the plug method. Select appropriate personal protective equipment to establish a turf by the plug method. Prepare turf for planting. Estimate the size of the plugs needed for the area of turf to be established. Make a judgment of the planting distance of plugs needed for establishing the turf by planting the plugs. Carrying out aftercare practices. Throughout the video, you will also be exposed to these employability skills: compliance with relevant regulations, horticultural standards, and OH&S requirements, adherence to industry standards and procedures, organizational skills, safety consciousness for self and others, attention to details, use of judgment, numeracy, thoroughness. We will be needing the following tools and materials. We will be using a hay fork, a spade, a garden rake, a machete, and a shovel. We'll also be using a piece of sod to prepare our plugs. We'll be using a knife. To perform these activities, we'll be employing the use of some personal protective equipment. These are a coverall, a pair of hard boots, and a pair of gloves. Let us look at how we select a piece of plug to establish our turf. A plug is a small piece of grass that is used to establish a turf. For this, we'll be using a piece of sod to prepare our plugs. Sod is basically a large piece of grass that is used to prepare a plug. To prepare our plug, we'll be using 2 to 3 inches as the size of each plug. So we'll cut into the sod, straight down the sod, make clean, sharp cut. As you can see, you can now estimate your measurement. Make horizontal cuts, ensure that you cut safely. Now that we have finished preparing our plugs, we will now go to prepare the turf using these plugs. Let's review how we select and prepare a plug for establishing a turf. Once you have selected the plugs, you are now ready to prepare the turf. An important part of this preparation is observing the condition of the work area and removing all extraneous materials such as lumps of soil, stones, lignin matter, and plastics. This is essential in order to have an even surface, making the soil friable to promote proper growth of the turf, to promote drainage and aeration. We need to examine the area to ascertain what is present at the location in terms of extraneous materials such as debris, stones. We need to look at the insects that are present. We need to look at the condition of the soil. We are now going to carry out our inspection. As you can see, this area has been recently dug up, so the soil is pretty much friable, loose. There's the presence of insects, earthworms, which indicate that our soil is pretty much fertile. There's twigs and other lignin matter such as roots. So we'll be going through this and doing a little sorting and grading to remove large clots of soil and also the stones and the other extraneous materials that are present. We'll be using the hay fork and we'll be going through the area looking for large stones and the extraneous materials that we had discussed before. After this, we'll be using our garden fork And be sure to prepare the area in a detailed manner, because your preparation will determine the quality of your turf. So we want to remove all stones and leave a layer of fine grade. If you observe closely, you'll see that the area is looking much better. Let's review how to carry out preparation of the work area by removing all extraneous materials, such as lumps of soil, stones, lignin matter, and plastics. This is essential in order to have an even surface, making the soil friable to promote proper growth of the turf, to promote drainage and aeration. Use a garden rake and a hand fork to remove all the unwanted material. Now we are going to determine the number of plugs we are going to need to prepare our turf. First, we are going to determine the size of the turf we are going to establish. Let us say this area that has been prepared is 12 square feet. How many plugs will we need to cover this area? Remember, the size of our plug is 3 inches. The area of our turf is 12 square feet, which is equivalent to 144 inches. We divide the area of 144 inches by the size of our plug, which is 3 inches, which is equivalent to 48 plugs. So a total of 48 plugs will be needed to establish our turf. Let's review how to determine the number and size of plugs for the area intended for establishing of turf. This can be achieved by measuring the area where the turf is to be planted and the size of the plugs. Once you have determined the planting distance, calculate how many plugs are needed by dividing the area of the turf by the planting distance. We are going to remove some amount of the soil to make the plugs easier to work with. We don't want to cut away too much of the soil to damage the root. We want to leave some amount of soil as to ensure that we minimize the shock for planting material. Let us plant our plugs. Create a little hole to accommodate the plug. We'll try to plant in a straight line, keeping the plugs as close as possible to each other. Gently press on the plugs so that the plugs make contact with the soil. After you have established your turf, you need to carry out some aftercare practices. We generally recommend that you water after you establish your turf. You can also fertilize. We irrigate the newly established turf because we want to minimize transplanting shock and also to make the root connect with the soil so your turf can grow very quickly. Thank you for watching this video on establishing a turf by using the plug method. By the end of the video, you should be able to select a plug, select appropriate tools, materials, and equipment needed for establishing a turf by the plug method. Select appropriate personal protective equipment to establish a turf by the plug method. Prepare turf for planting. Estimate the size of the plugs needed for the area of turf to be established. Make a judgment of the planting distance of plugs needed for establishing the turf by planting the plugs. Carrying out aftercare practices. Throughout the video, you will also be exposed to these employability skills: compliance with relevant regulations, horticultural standards, and OH&S requirements, adherence to industry standards and procedures, organizational skills, safety consciousness for self and others, attention to details, use of judgment, numeracy, thoroughness.